about the rugby, leaving out James Hall, I hear. Is that right? If I'm called, I'm ready to serve. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I met today with the state and territory treasurers, and we had an incredibly productive discussion about tax reform in Australia. For the 5 hours that we met today and 2 or 3 hours we met last night, we had a very frank discussion about the need for taxation reform in Australia and how we all need to work together to make sure that we can build a new tax system that will cope with the modern Australian economy. The state and territory treasurers agreed with the principles that I outlined for taxation reform. We also agreed to undertake further modelling in relation to specific taxation proposals. Specifically, the treasurers agreed to apply the GST to offshore sales into the Australian market. This is a significant initiative. From the 1st of July next year, from the 1st of July, I should say, 2017, the GST will be applied to all products and services sold by vendors overseas into Australia. This will deliver competitive neutrality for Australian businesses. It will ensure that there is a fair and equal treatment of all goods and services, so that if goods and services in Australia were to have the GST applied by companies in Australia, then the same would apply overseas. The Treasurers failed to come to unanimous agreement to remove the application of the GST on feminine hygiene products. As is required under the intergovernmental agreement, there needs to be unanimous agreement of all the state and territories to a change in the base of the GST. There was no agreement. Therefore, the matter has come to an end and the current arrangements are in play. So I'd just say again, it was a very productive discussion. We have agreed to meet again in September, October, to accept a further report in relation to taxation reform from our heads of treasuries and to feed into the Leaders' Conference which will be held in November. And there's a communique here that goes into considerable detail about all that. Yeah.
On the broader topic of increasing the GST and the various proposals being kicked around, given the states are a bit like Brown's cows about who wants what, and there's very little prospect of agreement, do you think time has come for the federal government to say this is what we want done in terms of increasing the GST and what taxes you want lowered to address bracket creep?
Well, we want to continue to work as closely as possible with the states and territories, because ultimately they will be the beneficiary of any changes to either the base or the rate of the GST. Importantly, there was recognition that we do need to reduce income tax rates and that the Commonwealth needs to do that in order to address bracket creep and the growing disincentive for people to earn more income as they go into a higher tax bracket. We had detailed discussions about individual taxes, the interaction of those taxes with the economy. There was recognition that the domestic economy is still feeling the effects of some dislocating market activity. For example, we know that there's quite a bit of speculative activity in residential real estate. Therefore, transaction taxes on residential real estate, even though they are not good economic taxes in the current environment, to remove stamp duty on residential property would only fuel speculation in that market, and that was not seen as a particularly good idea, as was, I made the point that introducing or increasing new taxes on superannuation at a period when we've got lower than expected returns would in fact be counterproductive for household consumption by people in their retirement age. And after all, household consumption actually is a big driver of economic growth. Overall, there was a clear message from the Treasurers. We recognise that whatever we do has to stimulate economic growth in Australia. We've got to have a tax system that facilitates innovation, facilitates investment, and facilitates job creation. I must say what was most pleasing was that, unlike the federal opposition, none of the states or territories were ruling anything out. And that was a positive step forward.
Treasurer, what sort of revenue flow are you expecting from the extension of the threshold change? And the carve-up of this money, my understanding is that it is being done on a per capita basis to the states and territories
This
under
is
the
the
seas.
extra, the integrity.
How long will that last? Like, will you actually end up with this growing amount of income going off into the years?
No.
Or is there a time cap on that?
No, this will go into the general GST pool. So there's no special treatment for the application of the GST below the low value threshold. It will be part of the overall GST pool. In relation to the amount of money that it will potentially raise, we've got to do further work in that regard. It's hugely important to understand that one of the impediments to delivering on this integrity measure in the past has been the enforceability of it. And that's because previously there were proposals that that each parcel that comes into the country should be inspected and determine whether that was less than a certain value. Quite frankly, that was ridiculous, and it was one of the reasons why ourselves and other jurisdictions resisted going down the path of fixing the low value threshold. However, as a result of our work in the G20 and in the OECD, there is now a growing global consensus where the vendors of goods and services overseas will willingly apply consumption taxes to their goods and services sold into a particular jurisdiction. In the case of Europe, that could be out to 2020. I think by the time the Europeans come to an agreement, they're moving in that direction. Some countries have moved faster than us in relation to digital products. Others are slower than us in relation to goods. But overall, we think we've got the balance right. From my perspective, if we can do it earlier than the 1st of July 2017, we will. But there's a lot of work to be done. And what it effectively means is that we're going to have taxation officials travel around the world and visiting these companies and asking them to register for GST purposes should they be selling into the Australian market goods or services greater than 75,000 Australian dollars in value.
How many are there? How many of these big companies greater than 75,000?
Oh, there could be hundreds. In relation to digital products, it's easy to identify a number of those companies, such as Netflix or Facebook or others. In relation to goods, there could be a very large number. However, what we are able to do is to narrow down the number of high volume goods vendors into Australia.
How many high volume?
Well, I'll come back to you about the specific figures that we have, but we're working to improve that data at the moment.
What will you do?
Sorry, we'll
what
go
will you
further.
do if
You're all the
company
same
doesn't-
stable, so I don't want to.
What will
create
you do if a
friction.
company doesn't pay? Just says no, I'm not going to do it.
Well, increasingly the global pressure is going to force them to respond. And if you've got very substantial companies like Amazon, who in some...
A small company.
Look, well, if you had substantial companies like Amazon that are operating in a number of jurisdictions and have considerable market share in some, they are actually quite willing to do it because effectively you know, they don't pay the tax personally. It's the consumer that pays the tax. So they're remitting it to us for taxation purposes. Having said that, it is also the case that we're pursuing our multinational tax initiatives, where companies that have engaged in what's known as the double Irish Dutch sandwich will be caught into our taxation net. And so ultimately these companies, whether they're providing digital products or they're providing physical products, ultimately, if you are of any scale, you're going to be caught into the global taxation network. And that's a direct result of the work we've been doing in both the OECD and in the G20.
On May 18, 2014, you said to Andrew Bolt, "We have a tax white paper, a process for looking at tax. We promised the Australian people we would not introduce, increase or broaden or change the GST in this term of government. We're honouring our promise. If there is to be a change to the GST or substantial changes in taxation, we will take that to the next election."
Yeah.
How is this not a broken promise?
Well, it's clearly integrity, and secondly, it starts on the 1st of July 2017, after the next election.
But you said you'd like to bring it in sooner rather, if you can, and you're actually introducing the changes in this
Well,
term
it
of
could be
Parliament.
6 months sooner, it may not be. We'll wait and see, but fundamentally,
This is not a broken
this is no, of course not, James, because it's an integrity measure. I mean, it's fundamental in this situation. Really is Friday afternoon for you guys, isn't it? I mean, these are integrity measures. We have to deal with integrity measures. If there's leakage out of the GST, it is our responsibility, with a unanimous agreement of the states and territories, to plug the hole. I mean, it's this unquestionably. The low value threshold has had a negative impact on Australian jobs and Australian businesses. So you would expect us to properly react, and we are. And we're doing it with the unanimous agreement of Labor states and territories and Liberal states and territories. Yeah, Sid.
There had been some concern that the administration of policing this without way to revenue. Are you now confident that you can actually raise some revenue from it? And I just want to check that the threshold will now be zero, won't it?
Yes, it is a zero threshold. And look, I am confident we can do it, because if it was going to be a case of inspecting every parcel, that was plainly ridiculous. There's been 3 or 4 different proposals put forward as a way of dealing with it. This is, we think, the best proposal because it's consistent with what's happening internationally. It is also the case that, you know, the companies are more willing now than they were a short period of time ago to comply. There's many levers we have to be able to apply some pressure to these companies. You know, the Australian government has been leading the world in many of these areas. We think it's patently unfair that your newspapers or your television stations have to charge advertisers GST, whereas someone selling a product into the same market, simply because they're based overseas, don't charge a GST. And it costs you your jobs ultimately. So we think it's only fair that this should be applied. The question has been, how do you do it? We've found a way forward. It's taken a lot of work, and we're working cooperatively with other jurisdictions, but we think this is the right response.
Do you think though that a fair bit will actually get through the net here?
Look, over time the integrity will increase. I mean, I'm not going to put a specific figure on it, but look, over time, the earlier we start, then the less effective it will be. But over time, we'll get greater and greater compliance, particularly as the Europeans come on board in 2020, because a number of these businesses have very significant operations in Europe. But I also live in hope that one day there will be real tax reform in the United States, so that may help in that regard. And as for other parts of Asia, I'm pretty confident that we can, through various agreements and various diplomatic avenues, forge arrangements and ensure that the companies do charge appropriate tax.
Could you just explain, you mentioned a $75,000 figure, is that a threshold anyone selling?
That's the same threshold in Australia, so it's the domestic threshold for GST registration here in Australia, and it'd be the same for someone operating internationally. So the same rules apply domestically and internationally.
Birds Crazy t-shirts from
Yeah,
Scotland.
that's right.
After
Yeah.
the
exactly.
Back
yeah.
in May, you expressed a view on sanitary products on Q&A. I'm sure you remember that moment.
So do the state treasurers, yeah.
Did you? They might have reminded you. Did you express a view at today's meeting?
Well, they know what my view was, and I said it's over to you guys. I've written to them and asked them to.
You didn't argue the case at this meeting.
Well, it was a simple case of going around the room asking people for their views, because we've already written to them, including with a proposal of the costs associated with the change. So they know my views. We talked about it last night in amongst the treasurers. Today it was simply a case, given we spent so much time on substantial tax reform, it was simply a case of going around the room and asking people. No, there was a majority. There were a number of jurisdictions that were opposed to any change.
How disappointed are you that state treasurers didn't agree with you on that?
Well, it's their tax, it's their revenue, and just as previously, some of the states have held out in relation to changes for the GST on low-value threshold goods and changes to the low-value threshold. So too, on this occasion, did some not agree. I mean, this is why we keep emphasising it is a state tax. And under the intergovernmental agreement, it's very specific that any changes to the base, as this would have been, or changes to the rate of the GST needs a unanimous agreement of the states and the territories. I mean, it's,
Bill Shorten wasn't committing to this change when spoke until earlier today. Do you expect Labor to back this or not?
well, they did today. A number of Labor states did back it today.
Federal Labor?
Oh, federal Labor, they're all over the shop. Who'd know? I mean, Bill Shorten commissioned a number of reports into it, if you remember, and he was actually advocating for that change when he was the minister responsible, the previous government. But who knows what his position is today?
Treasurer, the share market has lost another 2% today. It's about 65 billion down for the week, and it's off 13% since April. Are you worried about what that might be doing, feeding into the general economy, and does it have any budget ramifications?
No, you're going to get ups and downs. I mean, the S&P, I understand, was down quite a considerable amount overnight. There are going to be some pressure points in the economy, in the global economy, over the next few months. Obviously, we are carefully watching the deliberations of the US Federal Reserve. In my last discussions with Janet Yellen and at the IMF in April, the line put by the Federal Reserve was entirely consistent with that it's been putting for some period of time. That is, that it's of a mind to consider increasing interest rates in the United States in the latter part of this year. Now, in 2 or 3 weeks' time, I'll be travelling to Turkey for the G20. It will be a hugely important meeting because we'll all get a clearer indication of the thinking of the US Federal Reserve. There is a danger in these sorts of moments that you can have extraordinary capital flows, either out of equity markets into bond markets, or perhaps even out of capital movements out of emerging economies into the United States economy. In my discussions with Chairman Xu last week, the Chinese government is very mindful of the dislocations that may be associated with any increase in interest rates in the United States and the impact that'll have on currency. So there's lots of moving parts here. What I can say to you is that the Australian economy is incredibly robust. It continues to go through a transition. We have still, as of today, one of the fastest rates of economic growth of any developed nation in the world. We have highest job growth of any country compared with the G7. We are in pretty good shape, but we can always do better. Okay, yeah.
You said that there was an agreement that you wouldn't want to remove transaction taxes, given when we're talking about stamp duties.
Well, specific transactions, yeah. No.
Given it would overheat an already overheated property market. Was there any thought or consideration given to the idea of a land tax as a replacement tax, given it's a more efficient type of tax?
Well, there were discussions about what's occurred here in Canberra in the ACT, and also initiatives in South Australia. Look, transaction taxes, I emphasise, are inefficient taxes. Having said that, again, I emphasise that in certain markets, such as the residential property market at the moment, any immediate removal of transaction tax may well fuel speculative behaviour, because we're in a very low yield environment at the moment, and it is. I don't think we want to do anything that would add heat to the property market in some jurisdictions, not all. Some jurisdictions, but other than that, these are issues for the states. Okay.
Earlier today, Prime Minister Abbott said that if ICE doesn't respect the Syrian Iraq border, why should we? Do you expect we'll go in with airstrikes there?
I don't think the Prime Minister actually used those words, but what I do say to you is this: we have said repeatedly that ISIL or Daesh does not have any respect for borders, including our own, and wherever these people are, we need to be prepared to take action. And when our allies call to help in the fight against Daesh, obviously, we'll properly consider that request, and we'll do so through our proper processes. I know the Prime Minister spoke to the Leader of the Opposition today about it, and we'll work through these issues over the next 2 weeks. A final question.
Just on the transactional taxes, did the ACT Treasurer today say anything about house prices in the ACT being affected by the winding back of stamp duty?
Look, I'm not going to repeat what he did say, but I know what he has he has shown some courage in undertaking taxation reform here in the ACT, and I've said that before. Whether that's the right or wrong reform, ultimately it's in the hands of the people of the ACT, but he made a very constructive contribution today. We didn't know whether he was a plant from the leaders to be in the Treasurers' meeting, and I'm sure the leaders didn't know whether he was a plant from the Treasurers to be in the leaders' meeting.
What happened on the Medicare levy?
Well, there was a very active discussion about that as well, and again, we agreed to leave all options on the table and properly consider everything, even though I think my views in relation to increasing income taxes are well known. Thanks very much.